Dead Male is one of the best horror films of the year so far, and unfortunately from what I can tell, has been a bit overshadowed and overlooked. Partially I imagine because it was a direct-to-streaming film that did not hit theaters, but it is something that is definitely worth people's time, and is a film that I've not stopped thinking about since I saw it. It is a project about obsession, kink, fetishization, domination and control, nostalgia, the bitterness of the success of another, and the lingering traumas that dictate the decisions that we make later in life. It is a movie that was made for the real freaks, but also not overtly so. Nothing in this is as obvious as, say, a club scene where people are being whipped and fisting each other and screaming in pain while dressed in leather, but more so is about the underlying yearning in the small, almost imperceptible human social movements that gives away the true desire of the person who does them in shots that linger for longer than they really should. And I also think me calling it one of the best of the year so far is probably fairly controversial to a degree, as audiences seem to be kind of split on this one. A lot of very high reviews that are balanced out with a lot of very low ones, with not a lot in the middle that are ambivalent to it as a work. I think one of the best things that a film can do is to be polarizing. That means it is at least attempting something interesting, even though it may not succeed in that goal with everyone. But I would much rather produce a work of art that was hated by 50% of people than to make something that everyone thought was just okay, only for them to forget that they had even seen it a week later. Narratively, it is fairly simple. Josh is an artist, one who can't find the foothold that he needs to elevate his craft, which is designing synthesizers. The film is a period piece, by the way, if you can't tell by now. He's looking for opportunities with electronic companies to sponsor him to build the project that he has in mind, and that is when Trent enters his life. A moderately wealthy man who, for mostly unknown reasons, wants to give Josh anything that he needs to complete his project, even cooking for him and feeding him, so that no time is spent wasted on menial tasks that are taking away from time that could have been spent on the art. Their partnership devolves into obsession on the part of Trent, as Josh decides that it is time for him to continue to look for sponsorships with other companies because he's uncomfortable with this setup. Trent decides that he can't let Josh go after everything that they have worked on together, shackling him in chains and forcing him to work in the basement until the new perfect synth is created, which then brings a different man, Jasper, into the picture, who works for the Postal Service Company, who notices something unusual with Trent's mail and becomes obsessed over it, not letting it go and stumbling into a rabbit hole of the sexual dynamic that is happening between these two men. As a work, it is very much in the same tradition as a Hitchcockian thriller rather than an outright horror movie. The name of the game here is suspense, and it delivers very few outright true scares. But that's not a bad thing at all. I don't think horror should be concerned outright with scares, but instead with mood, with tension. If a scare works and is appropriate, fine, but often they are used as a band-aid to distract from bad filmmaking and bad writing. And it's nice to see a film like Dead Male not feel like it has to engage in that to still be horror. And when I say that the film is Hitchcockian, I mean that not only on a surface level, but also on a deeper thematic one as well. As we have some of the normal things that you would associate with that, such as an unexpected mid-film main protagonist shift, but also the film exists in this weird, bizarro, psychosexual tension between the main villain and the black people that he surrounds himself with, whom he clearly fetishizes, making the film a bit uncomfortable to talk about to an extent. And also in Hitchcockian tradition, this is all rendered a little bit questionable as subject material, because from what I can tell, the writers and directors of this are all white. Similarly to how Hitchcock often wrote about women in a very specific way without actually having that lived experience for himself, which does affect the end goal representation that winds up on the screen. I think that people should be able to depict what they want to or are called to do within art, and I'll defend that till my dying breath. I don't actually think that there's a problem with this per se, but I do think that it is at least important to acknowledge that this film with a mostly black cast about issues that affect black characters that are caused by a white character is also coming from a white perspective. As we soon learn that Trent is doing this because of a trauma that he received as a young man by being rejected sexually by a fellow student, a black kid that he was obsessed over named Reggie. At night here now, as an older man, still all of this time later, he listens to synth music and just sits in his chair and stares at old photographs of Reggie. And because this love that he had was unrequited, and that he never quite seemed to get the closure on that chapter of his life that he clearly needed, he now has this intense sexual obsession, it seems, on black men. He has allowed this crush that he had like 30 years ago develop into almost a full-blown kink, to the point where he gets sexually excited by the idea of listening to Josh work in silence on the synthesizer over the telephone. This obsession carries him even into death later, when he decides to end his own life out of the shame of what he's done, by eating one of his prisoners' favorite meals that he has prepared and then poisoned for himself. There's a great deal of shots and scenes actually throughout the film of Trent around food, preparing food, eating food, and through this he is in our minds synonymous with consumption. That is all he is, a vampire in all ways except for that of the supernatural. And this even also somewhat ties into his unconscious racism, or at the very least classism as well. As when Josh is telling Trent what he wants for dinner, he says that he wants the fried rice dish from the local Japanese place. And Trent makes an assumption and asks him if he usually gets the pork or the steak with that. And Josh looks a little embarrassed and says that he usually actually gets the chicken, which of course would be the cheapest protein option offered. We also at another point see Josh eating a microwave frozen meal in his home, instead of something that he's made with fresh ingredients, which is another indicator where food is being used to demonstrate non-verbally a person's economic background and situation in life. But what I also find interesting in this is that Josh too is fetishistic of a different culture, but in this case, the Japanese. Even down to his love of synthesizers, his desire to work for a Japanese company that produces them, his life goal of moving to Japan, even teaching himself Japanese on the side in his spare time, which is something that he is clearly very proud of when he's able to showcase this skill. Even in the scene where he confesses these desires to Trent, he's wearing a bathrobe that looks like a kimono. So there's these little layers to this thread that weave throughout the film, and I enjoy looking for small things like that which relate to that kind of appropriation. You know, spiteful obsession is a hell of a thing, one that we are probably all guilty of at some point in our lives, myself included. The book that I've been working on forever that is almost done now even began out of that same emotion, and is even dedicated to someone from my past whom I feel personally wronged me in a very personal and deep way. Something which I admit I did take from V.C. Andrews, who famously dedicated Flowers in the Attic to her mother. Spite can keep you going more than anything else. Spite is powerful, but it is also dangerous. It is corrupting. It robs you of your human element. It clouds your thoughts and makes you think in negative patterns and can clearly, as this film shows, lead to some very bad decision making. And in that, I don't actually think that Trent is necessarily an evil guy at all. I don't think that he has a plan going on in this movie. He's just acting instead of reacting. And he acted irrationally, and now is just trying to cover that up in any way that he can so that nobody finds out. I think that is a lot more compelling for an antagonist rather than just someone who embodies evil. There are in this mindset a great deal of conversations throughout the work about glue and epoxies that I can't fully decide why they are here. It has to mean something. They talk about glue at least 6 times throughout the film's runtime, and how some glues are better for others for different purposes. And I just feel like this has to be intended in a metaphorical sense in some way, but what that metaphor is, I am uncertain. But I've spent more time in the past few days contemplating what they mean when they're talking about glue than I'd like to admit, and have come back with little to nothing good. Other than the film is about these two men who are held together through this partnership that begins to fall apart. A partnership that acts as a binding agent that keeps them connected to one another. That Josh is eventually chained up, which is a very charged image, and in a way is glued to this spot and forced against his will to continue to work on this project. But in that, I don't actually know what they're trying to say here. There's an ongoing theme throughout the piece of people trying and failing to fit in with their surroundings, and this may fall into this as well, such as Trent trying to blend in as an employee of the post office, or Jasper, for instance, trying to fit in with the other residents of the men's home that he lives at, but cannot find any new friends and cannot find a bunkmate to share his room with, which is something that distresses him. Also the fact that Jasper's job is to track dead mail, which is mail that can't be returned to the sender and doesn't fit in with the rest of the mail. Trent also talks later in the film about the nature of being passive in his past, which led to Reggie rejecting him, and how that has now made him be an active actor in his destiny now, which all of this may be glued together or not. I also in this quite appreciate that the visual style that they decided to go for is reminiscent of the period in which they are trying to evoke. I think that all the talk of synthesizers and the like is complemented well with the way in which they decided to design and shoot this, from all angles, from the hair and wardrobe just to the way that these rooms feel, down to the excellent period music that echoes across its soundtrack. It is a realistic, grounded nightmare of the 1980s that really works for me. Now, with this though is a problem, not just with this film, but with Shudder as a platform in general, in that out of any of the streaming services that I've used, their visuals are the lowest quality, and that makes a lot of this effort seem really not worth it on their original content. Their streams, from what I've read, cop out at 720p, which in this day and age, if your job is distributing new films, that is just a massive ball drop as far as I'm concerned. It's unacceptable, really. I couldn't imagine actually trying to pass that off on a service that people paid for. And the only reason that I think that Tubi is allowed to get away with it is that Tubi is free, and doesn't make a ton of new original content, mostly showing things that would be presented in 480 and 720 even if they had the ability to broadcast in higher resolutions. And nobody ever really talks about this that much. They just accept that movies on there by and large look bad, even if they were shot this year. Which further goes into that point that I made last year about horror being this thing that needs to be protected by the insular group at all costs, including ignoring obvious major problems that could be fixed if people actually demanded that they happened. It's kind of amazing to me that everyone in horror, who by and large typically are very into 4K discs and boutique distributors, have collectively said that this is just the way that it is in relation to Shudder's streaming quality, which I think is a big piece of evidence to support the argument that I made there. But anyways, because Dead Male is trying to emulate an older style of movie, along with more intense colors and high grain on the footage, it suffers more than most films do on that platform, by having that work and many shots just get compressed to muddy details. I imagine that this film would look substantially better on Blu-ray, and deserves better if I'm fully honest. They were trying to emulate what an early 1980s movie would look like, but instead were unfortunately pushed into the position of emulating the experience of watching an early 1980s movie on a DVD in the early 2000s. But despite this, it doesn't hold back from what a weird and fun work this is. I think that this is great. It clearly was shot for little money, but the script and strange acting decisions really carry it into being a very strong project. And I hope to see more from this team in the future. Just a great vision on this from all angles that really leaves you with a lot to think about after it's done.